وآل محمد.
Salam and many thanks for you to coming here tonight and joining us in this tumultuous weather. Tonight we are going to have a discussion regarding Jihad in Islam and the concept of Jihad. So without any further ado, I invite Hajjaba to give us a description of Jihad and what a short talk, and inshallah then we start with some questions. Muhammad al Muhammad salawat.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So today our topic is Jihad. And Jihad is a concept that is as well known to non-Muslims as it is to Muslims, at least in name. But it's a concept that is very frequently poorly understood and very frequently abused. The general understanding that the majority of non-Muslims have of Jihad is that it is something that is military, and that it is aggressive, and that it is extreme. And the understanding that we have within Islam is sometimes abused in the opposite direction. Muslims will have become apologetic or defensive, and we will sometimes say that Jihad is primarily an inward or an internal or a spiritual type of a reality. And the truth is that Jihad is an external and a potentially even a military obligation, but it is primarily an inward and a spiritual obligation and teaching of Islam. We shouldn't ever get caught up in the hype in the media and think that Jihad refers primarily to armed struggle or holy warfare. But we also should not get caught up in apologetics and think that that aspect of Islam is something to be embarrassed about. In fact, the spiritual reality of Jihad is one of the most beautiful parts of our Islamic teachings and the ahadith of the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt. And the exterior conduct of war or a military campaign is also one of the most beautiful parts of our Islamic teachings. Unlike other schools of thought, Islam did not have to develop a just war concept on the basis of non-scriptural sources. Because our scripture, our Quran, the practice of the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt, and the teachings of Ahlul Bayt, they gave us a very beautiful concept of what a just war is. When is war justified? When is it to be avoided? And when war is justified, how it is to be conducted and prosecuted. That framework governing and the rules governing even the exercise of a military campaign, that is one of the beautiful teachings of Islam that we have, and we should not be afraid of it. But of course, if we are going to divide our attention, the majority of our attention should go towards that which is the most important. The hadith about al-Jihad al-Akbar and al-Jihad al-Asghar, it's found in al-Kafi, so it's found in our most authentic sources of Shi'i hadith, but it's also a narration that is found in authentic Sunni sources. And so this is part of the shared heritage of Islam. And you are, I'm sure, all familiar with the story. The group came back from a military campaign. When people do that, generally they think that they have accomplished something. There's actually studies that say that don't make too many decisions, because when you have stress and you make decisions and the quality of your future decisions, it goes down. So sometimes people will be given this advice based on behavioral science that if you have an important task to do at 11 o'clock, then don't waste your time deciding what kind of coffee to get and what kind of breakfast to get and what kind of minor things to do, because each of those decisions has some level of stress. When you've made a bunch of even small decisions, the quality of future decisions will go down. There's fatigue that sets in. So now, when people are coming back not from a minor stressful activity like having to choose what kind of coffee to get, but a major struggle, a major stress in their life, they're coming back from a battlefield. And the Prophet says, "Marhaba biqawmin qadaw al-jihad al-asghar wa baqiya alayhim al-jihad al-akbar." Welcome to people who've done the small task, and now they have the big struggle. And that is a major statement of priorities in Islam. Now, as I said, the hadith is found in sources of Ahlul Bayt and in broader Islamic sources. I think we can safely say, however, that it really is the teachings and the followers of Ahlul Bayt who have properly maintained that balance, that the inward jihad is to be the major struggle, and the outward jihad is to be observed and honored, but never made the primary form of our practice of jihad. And so that's a brief introduction, inshallah, to the concept of jihad. And I hope that in our conversation, and of course, with the participation of all of you, we will be able to continue the conversation. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
It's number 2. You have to lower it.
Normally when there's technical difficulties during a sensitive subject, people wonder, is this because something is being surveilled?
Okay,
or
yeah.
Hopefully it's not the
It is, yeah. I really feel sorry, Maulana, for those families that are living in US and their son is named Jihad and the father calls the mother and says, I have to talk to you about Jihad. I wonder what NSA does to them. Question for the audience, both sisters and brothers. What is the root of word Jihad? Can anybody tell me that? Except Brother Mansour sitting over there. What is the root of word Jihad? Can anybody guess that?
It comes from the Jihad, I think.
Okay, can you please explain if you have a microphone or you want to?
Well, I think Jihad means fort, comes from the Jahd, or Jihad is from the meaning of it should be attempting or fort. And in Farsi we call it halash. It's something comes from this word.
Struggle.
Struggle.
Yeah. Very good. Ajmal, you want to elaborate on that?
That's correct. The word jihad comes from a root, jahida yajhadu, which means to strive, to struggle, to attempt. And interestingly, the word jihad is not used in the Quran in a military context. Sometimes it's a relevant discussion for us as Muslims to think to how our Islamic terminology is used. We have certain words that we use in a certain meaning. Right? We use the word shaheed generally to mean a person martyred in battle. But the usage of the word shaheed in the Quran is not just for a person killed in battle. It is a more comprehensive, thank you. It is a more comprehensive meaning. Right? The Prophet is called the shaheed over his ummah, which is a spiritual rank and not just a matter of having given one's life in the way of Allah. Similarly, we have the word jihad. Right? It's used in the Quran, but its usage in the Quran is not in a primarily military way. Now, as we'll discuss, the Quran does use the word jihad in a way that can be extended to a military struggle, but the primary usage is spiritual. When the Quran speaks about fighting, then it says qital. Qital means from the root qatala, to kill. But jihad is a more comprehensive meaning. The last verse of Surah Al-Ankabut is وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا. That those who struggle in our way, we will guide them to our path. So jihad in the Quran is connected not to nasr or intisar or fath or victory, but jihad is connected to guidance. And that, by the way, is not to exclude a military campaign. In battle, Muslims are not seeking a military victory. They're seeking to be guided. The greatest victory that we have in our tradition as Muslims, especially as followers of Ahlul Bayt, is the Battle of Karbala. It's an example of how a Muslim should be willing to sacrifice body and soul and spirit and property in the way of Allah. And that was a victory because every one of the participants in the Battle of Karbala was guided. So even a military campaign is connected to guidance, and therefore this verse is not purely spiritual. It is comprehensive. But when the primary result of jihad, وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا, is hidayah, that reminds us that the Quranic concept of jihad is a spiritual concept. And this is explained in a hadith that مَنْ عَمِلَ بِمَا عَلِمْ وَرَّثَ اللَّهُ عِلْمَ مَا لَمْ يَعْلَمْ. A person who performs what they know. If I do what I know to be right, then Allah will grant me, and the word used in Arabic is وَرَّثَهُ اللَّهُ عِلْمَ مَا لَمْ يَعْلَمْ, will grant me as inheritance that which I don't know. Meaning I don't need to be too concerned about it. There's a difference between kasb and iktisab and wiratha. You don't go in search of wiratha. The types of people who go in search of wiratha are the types of people who are not worthy of that wiratha. You don't try to hasten the death of your family members so that you can inherit from them. That is to be accomplished according to God's timetable and according to His plan. And it comes naturally to those who are the deserving recipients. A grandparent dies, the heirs will be the children and grandchildren. Right? A spouse dies, the heirs will be the spouse. The point is that you're not seeking to get it. You are living your life as a worthy family member and heir, and the wiratha will come according to God's plan. So the hadith says that in this verse, Allah is saying, those who struggle in His way, وَرَّثَهُ اللَّهُ عِلْمَ مَا لَمْ يَعْلَمْ. Allah will grant you the knowledge of what you don't know. Now that's not to say you don't go and seek knowledge, but primarily your focus should be do what you know. Practice it. You already know enough. All of us. And our major bottleneck is not that I need to go to an arif and find out some special dua, or I need to find out some special wadhifa or dastur amal, or it's that I need to practice better. And if I'm bringing my practice up, then the next stage of knowledge, God's going to give it according to His guarantee. So that's a logic and a progression that we have mentioned in the Quran, and it gives us a nice comprehensive understanding of what jihad is. It's the struggle in the way of Allah with everything that we have. And the military aspect is just one part of that, and it's not, by any means, the major part of that.
You mentioned something right now, jihad of fisabilillah, struggle in the way of Allah. Do we have any other kind of jihad?
Well, every jihad that is Islamic is jihad fi sabilillah, but fi sabilillah is a very broad category. There is, I think, a misconception that exists in some deviant schools of thought that fi sabilillah implies war. There might be another misconception among some Muslims that fi sabilillah implies, for example, studying Islam and becoming an alim. I've seen that in some communities where a person, a young man or a young woman who has a pure heart and wants to serve Islam, they think the only way they can serve Islam is to go and become a scholar and serve a community or serve Islam in the capacity of a scholar. We all have different resources at our disposal, and we all have different circumstances, talents, and abilities. And fi sabilillah is a broad enough category to encompass all of those individual circumstances that we have. And so I don't need to think that there's only one way for me to embark on jihad. Any kind of charitable work that's done for the sake of Allah. Any kind of volunteering work that is done for the sake of Allah. Any kind of personal development, worship, or devotion that's done for the sake of Allah. Any type of human relationship or family relationship that is created or that is honored for the sake of Allah. Any type of educational project that is embarked on for the sake of Allah is jihad. It is fi sabilillah. And we don't need to limit our views towards those that are the most romantic or romanticized, or the ones that are the most prominent, or the ones that are recognized by society. So fi sabilillah is a broad category, and that is why when it comes to the utilization of zakat, for example, in the month of Ahlul Bayt, it's not just for defending Islamic soldiers or armies. It can be used to build a hospital or a school or a masjid or support scholarship or any of those causes, because all of those causes are pleasing to Allah. And therefore spending money in that path, or spending our resources in that path, our time, is pleasing to Allah.
Any question from the... Go ahead, please.
I think as a Muslim community, we've done a pretty good job of explaining it to the non-Muslim community about how, there's a lesser jihad and a greater jihad. But I guess the logical next question is, that's fine, you have a greater jihad, but what about the lesser jihad? Is that, how does that apply to you as a Muslim today? Somebody was to ask me, fine, you have a greater jihad, that's fine. But how does the lesser jihad apply to your life as a Muslim in today's world?
That's a good question. And sometimes we don't give enough attention to that smaller jihad or that lesser jihad. And there's certain laws in Islam that deal with the prosecution of war. Can Muslims engage in an offensive war rather than just a defensive battle? Can we say that, you know what, we have this neighboring country and they're not Muslim, and we're going to add them to our empire. Not because they've attacked us, but as an offensive jihad. Can we do a preemptive strike? Right? So generally speaking, these areas are matters of law. They have been dealt with by Shi'i scholars and by Sunni scholars. And that's one area of the lesser jihad. Right? Can you poison wells? Can you damage the environment? What are you supposed to do when there is the potential for civilian casualties, or what people sometimes call collateral damage? And there's laws governing that. Generally, as a general principle, within a certain range of debate that exists, The view of Shi'i Muslim scholars is that only a defensive jihad is permissible, and it can only be prosecuted in a way that will minimize any kind of loss of life to civilians and to non-combatants. Now, the other part of the same question of lesser jihad is not just the prosecution of a war, but amr bil ma'ruf and nahi anil munkar, because that is also a physical component of jihad. And in this regard, our fuqaha and scholars generally say that as a Muslim, you do have a relationship of wilayah to other Muslims. Right? When the Quran says believers are brothers, إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ إِخْوَةٌ, the difference between a brother and an acquaintance or a friend is that when you have a family member, you have a special responsibility. If my brother has a health problem, I don't just say, maybe you want to go to a doctor and get it checked out. If I don't see them taking action, I'll make an appointment and I'll take them there. At least, maybe brotherhood now has been watered down, but in the time of the Quran and in the culture of Islam, brotherhood was a very meaningful and a very close relationship. And the Quran says that the believing men and women are awliya of one another. That same concept exists. Wilayah is not just a top-down relationship, it's a mutual relationship. I have a right on you and you have a right on me. So that's also part of that exterior jihad. That I look at you and I say, I'm going to interfere in your private life. Not in an offensive way, not in an excessive way, but I'm not going to say, well, that's his business. This person isn't coming to the masjid, they've kind of cut themselves off from family, they're engaging in behavior that is self-destructive. I can't say as a Muslim, that's their business. I'm not going to butt in. I do have to involve myself and interfere. But there is a limit, and that is that I cannot physically force or compel. Intrinsically, that is part of the lesser jihad. I am allowed to compel good behavior and prohibit evil behavior. Not but Islam allows that. The difference, though, is that when it comes beyond verbal and it becomes beyond a moral and an ethical reminding and admonishing, the Shi'i Muslim belief is that only a person given that authority by Allah, in the first place a prophet or an imam, can exercise that authority. Because only they know all of the potential repercussions, backlash, and harm that might result. So, if I know somebody is going to get drunk, Islamically, if there's no other way to stop them, it can be permissible to compel them not to do that. But that power is not something that I can exercise or that you can exercise. We can exercise the reminder, the admonishment, the expression of happiness when something good happens, or anger when something bad is being done. But if the person doesn't listen to that or it doesn't have an effect, I can't say I'm going to lock you up because I want to prevent you from sinning. Within the logic of Islam, though, that power does exist. And that power exists only in the hands of somebody who has the requisite knowledge and the requisite ability to utilize it in the proper way. In modern societies, the state has some sort of wilayat of that form. The state can interfere in my family and, in certain conditions, take my children away from me and say that I'm not a fit parent. The state can regulate certain behavior and say that you need to give this vaccine or you need to do this thing. And so don't get scared. That, well, why is Islam giving this wilayah that interferes in a person's private life? Even our secular society gives that wilayah. The difference, though, is that the secular society gives that wilayah generally to a political authority, and it gives it within a certain framework. The Islamic logic gives it to a religious authority, and it gives it in a broader framework because of the qualifications of that religious authority.
Any questions from Sister side? Okay.
Actually, there are like a couple of questions. First, what you just mentioned about the difference between a secular versus a religious, basically, or Islamic system. I think, I mean, the thing is, a secular system usually respects individual values. So, a secular system does not fight to impose basically a value that a person does not personally respect. Usually, that's not the case. But the Islamic basically system, it is happening sometimes that a group of people just basically try to impose some certain rules that come from Sharia and is not respected. So basically you could easily be a very religious Muslim and then live in a secular society. But sometimes it's not possible the opposite way. So you cannot be a very secular system living.
Sometimes Muslims do a bad job
right. They
of
force you to
understanding.
practice the Sharia even though that's not the personally accepted.
Yeah, sometimes we Muslims do a bad job of understanding the fact that Sharia is not just the superficial external practice, but it is also the process by which we implement that process. So the concept of imamate, for example, in Islam, is not just about who is to be the imam, but it also encompasses how the imam is to exercise and assert his authority. And if we look at that more deeply, if we go back to our original sources and the practice of the imams, we will see that in fact the imams respected individual and societal rights in a far more profound way than even many democratic systems do. Many secular systems tend to be majoritarian. Right? And by majoritarian, what I mean is that the majority is considered justified to exercise its will even against the wishes or the interests of the minority, except within certain limits. So the majority can't decide to just kill and steal the property of the minority. But largely speaking, that can be done. If you look at the practice of Imam Ali, for example, he refused to receive authority, political authority, except in such a way that there was an overwhelming consensus. He didn't even want to get 51%. If there was going to be 51% of the people, the Imam might have said, I will continue to discuss and negotiate and find a way for society to reach consensus. We see that the Imam rejected the government that was offered to him in the time of Uthman, even though if he had accepted, nobody would be able to really question how he was going to exercise it effectively. Imam Ja'far Sadiq did a similar thing when the Abbasid revolution was taking place. Some of the supporters of the Abbasids, like Abu Salama al-Khallal, they had their doubts. Right? Because during the course of the struggle, they realized that maybe Ahlul Bayt were not all just one group. And there were people who were perhaps better or worse. And they sent messages. They were basically under the guidance of the Abbasids. But they sent messages to Abdullah ibn Mahdi, the descendant of Imam Hassan, and to Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salam. And Imam Ja'far Sadiq was the only one who said that I'm not going to have any part in this. I'm not going to try to take over a movement, because political power or enforcing Sharia is not my goal. I need to acquire my influence in society or my political power through a certain process. And that process, as we see in the teachings and in the practice of the Imams, was by first developing a consensus, first raising people's awareness, and only enforcing that which was able to be a hujjah on people, where the proof of the authority was complete. So that's a problem that we have as Muslims. We can't blame somebody else. We need to be much more clear about viewing Sharia, viewing Islam as a set of teachings and also our relationship to those teachings. I don't want to give a wishy-washy message and say there's no force, there's no compulsion, there's no executive feature in Islam. Islam is just a moral authority. But whatever that executive feature is, or function is, whatever that exercise of force is, that is part of Sharia. And sometimes we do exercise force and sometimes we don't.
I have one more question. So, well, one question, of course, is whether or not when the Imam or the Prophet is not here, a decision can be made to invade another country or to involve in a war. But the second question is basically the details of the practice and the rules that one may basically practice during the war. So in this, like, what we see sometimes today is that some people are just basically killed or punished only because they have a different religion or different perspective, or basically, so those details. My question is, can you talk a bit about what are the rules that even during the war Muslims are obligated to obey and follow?
What are the rules that Muslims are obligated to follow? First is not to enter into a war without exploring the possibility of peace, without exploring the possibility of a negotiated or a settled resolution of hostilities. The ideal is to have an ahd, a covenant or an agreement between different political and social systems, not to have a state of conflict. That is the default position in Islam. Not war, but peace. And that comes through if you look at the verses of the Quran that talk about the prosecution of war. The second thing is that in Islam, we are required not to prosecute a war in such a way that innocent people are targeted or that innocent people are killed, except if there is really no other way. So sometimes there are choices that are made. Right? We say that we're going to fight a battle in such a way that we minimize casualties to our side. And that's the way that generally modern warfare is conducted. That's not a human way to conduct warfare, though, because by trying to minimize casualties to our side, we're necessarily going to have to increase the ratio of casualties on the other side. The nature of warfare will be more inhuman, and Islam does not permit that. That's why the spirit of warfare in Islam is be ready to sacrifice. Be ready to actually, if it's worth fighting for, then it's worth dying for. It's not just that it should be worth killing for. A principle that is worth fighting for is one that should be worth dying for. And so modern warfare from an Islamic perspective is largely something that is both cowardly and not permitted. We do have extensions of the traditional teachings that we have about not harming the environment, cutting down trees and poisoning wells by some fuqaha in the modern world. For example, about weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons and nuclear weapons, that these are forbidden. If a faqih were to say that they are permitted, then that would simply be because society has these weapons. No Shia Muslim faqih would say that biological and chemical weapons are intrinsically okay. At most, some may give the ruling that because your enemy has these weapons and they will threaten you with them, you are permitted to develop in order to be able to repel that threat as a deterrence. But at the same time, you are obligated to work towards a world where both you and your enemy will not be threatening each other with that kind of a weapon. And some fuqaha have given the fatwa that these weapons of mass destruction are prohibited even if your enemy has them. Find some other means of engaging in a deterrence through conventional means and through means that are not as dangerous and costly to humanity because it results in brinkmanship. So that's a general framework for how the traditional laws of warfare in Islam, let's say you cannot kill a child, you cannot kill a woman, you cannot kill somebody who has fled the battlefield. How would that translate into a modern period where the battlefield is not two armies meeting with swords and spears, on a certain land?
Any questions?
Yes, I have a question about the difference between Jihad Akbar and Jihad Asghar. One of the reasons that people try to develop a better spiritual life is that they can easily let their life go. So one thing that actually helps during the Jihad Akbar is that then you are prepared to easily give your life for Jihad Asghar. So my question is that if this is the one of the goals of the Jihad Akbar, why the actual Jihad is Asghar and the other one is Jihad Akbar?
Is that one of the goals of Jihad Akbar? Which is the goal serving the other? Is one of the goals of Jihad Akbar in order for you to engage in Jihad Asghar? Or is one of the goals of Jihad Asghar, meaning the physical battle, in order to allow society and individuals to engage in Jihad Akbar? And if you look at Surah Al-Fath and the circumstances around the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, you see that the Muslim street, right? Sometimes you have leaders who drag their people into battle, and sometimes you have people who want to drag their statesmen into battle. In the battle of, or in the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, at least some of the companions were itching for a battle, because they thought they could enter from a position of strength. And the Prophet said, no, we've accomplished our goal with a treaty. And some of the Muslims said, even prominent companions, their names are mentioned in history, that this is a bad battle, this is a bad treaty. It makes the unbelievers seem stronger. And the Prophet said, we secured the right to preach Islam, and they recognized that people have a right to listen and to convert to Islam, to accept Islam. We've acquired our victory. So the Muslims were viewing Islam, or Jihad Akbar, it's not Jihad Akbar per se, but Islam is religious teachings and practice that allow us to develop spiritually. So that Jihad Akbar, they saw it as one way so that we can acquire a political victory. The Prophet did the opposite. He said that if we were going to have Jihad Asghar or a battle, it would have been to allow people to learn about Islam and accept Islam. And since we got that without a battle, forget the battle. And that was the beginning of the Fath Mubin, which the Prophet was promised by Allah.
Any questions? So I have a question.
Sure. And I think just to keep an eye on the clock, we have about
We have another
10 minutes or so, 5
to
10
10
minutes.
minutes. I'm going to ask you the question again.
Good.
Just go on.
Keep them on their toes.
Yeah. Can anybody tell me how many times the word peace, sulh, has come in Quran? You have time to search. Ajala is not going to say how many times, but maybe he can tell
Ajala doesn't
us.
know exactly. I'll admit that right from the beginning.
But if you, whoever wants to search it, please. Meanwhile, Ajala, can you tell us a little bit what's the difference between sulh and taslim, which means surrender and peace? And today we have a lot of discussions going on around the world. Some people want others to be taslim, others want to have a sulh. So please.
It's a good question, and it's a debate that is not just for Muslims. So, in the current negotiations between, I don't want to say Iran and the world, I'll say between Iran and the US. In essence, it's a two-party debate. Similarly, in previous similar kinds of negotiations, there's always going to be a party that says any kind of accommodation with a former enemy or with a present enemy is a surrender. Right? poor Prime Minister of England, Chamberlain, is still accused of having surrendered to Hitler and is contrasted unfavorably with Churchill. In Islam, surrender is only for Allah. And beyond our surrender to Allah, we are not to submit, surrender, or lower ourselves before anyone else. In fact, that's one of the main effects of Tawheed that we as Muslims have been taught. That this is one servitude that frees you from surrendering, submitting, or servitude to anyone else. It is one form of servitude that frees you of servitude from anyone else. So any relationship that we have with our enemies, with other individuals or societies, it should be based on a recognition of priorities and a mutually negotiated and respectful interaction. The surrender that we make to Allah will define what our priorities are. And the first priority that Muslims have is that our right to practice our religion and to proclaim our religion be recognized. And on that basis, we can engage in cordial relationships with other people. So that will be sulh, because it is based on the surrender we make to Allah. If in some cases we are going to be more flexible in our interactions with even an enemy, or perhaps less flexible, correct? We see both aspects of that reflected in the practice of Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein and our other Imams as well. Then that is going to be based on what priorities are given to us by Allah. It's going to be based on the state of our ummah. It's going to be based on the ideals of Islam. Sulh should not be viewed as, well, if you compromise, on 5 points, then that's okay. But if you compromise on 10 points, that's no longer a negotiation, that's submission. Right? Sulh should be viewed in terms of the relationship to the priorities of Islam, how it fits into our submission to Allah. Something may be a very superficially poor deal, but because it sets the stage for a greater victory, it is not going to be viewed as a submission. One example is Hudaybiyah, and one example is the Treaty of Imam Hassan. So after the treaty was signed, and Muawiyah pledged not to harass the followers of the Shia of Imam Ali. Muawiyah pledged not to harm any of those who were supporters of Imam Hassan's right. And according to some versions of that treaty, not all versions, but according to some, perhaps the most authentic versions of that treaty, Muawiyah even pledged to return the leadership to Imam Hassan. Imam Hassan could have predicted that Muawiyah was not likely to follow through with that treaty. It seemed, perhaps superficially, like even a weaker treaty than Hudaybiyah. If anything was going to be called a submission, then that would be called a submission. But why would it not be? Right? Again, it's not the superficial terms of the treaty, but it's a decision rooted in hikmah and wisdom. What is the current danger facing Islam? And how can we most preserve what Islam needs? Many of the Imams made efforts to ensure that their life was preserved. They engaged in taqiyya to preserve their life. Correct? Why? Because they were afraid of death? Certainly not. When the time came, they were very happily they would go forward for martyrdom. Why? Because at that time, to harm their own lives would not serve any purpose for Islam. It might even cause damage. So that's the basis by which we can make the decision. Did we have a number for the
So does anybody have a number for how many times the word peace has come in Quran?
34.
Huh?
34.
34 times, okay. Now your next challenge is how many times the word qatalu, meaning battle, fight, has come in Quran. Let's find that one. Okay. One example of it is the peace treaty that Imam Khomeini accepted at the end of the Iran-Iraq war, which he said is a poison that I am taking, but there was a greater wisdom in that. Now, we return to another item. You said there are times that jihad is mandatory. I named 3-4 items for you, and if you can. Before I do that, anybody has any questions?
So my question is that how this, look at Daesh for example. You see that easily people go and do jihad and they kill themselves for, they say that, okay, so somebody gonna ask this question that, okay, if these people are bad, how they easily can give their life for such a goals. So, I mean, can you a little bit elaborate on this topic?
In fact, that's mentioned in the hadith of Imam Ja'far. I believe it was Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam. He told people that the Shia were people who had a keen eye to injustice. That was true throughout history. And when you see injustice, right, that is what you can say is a major factor towards potential radicalization. Right? You're not going to find radicalized people who are not being oppressed severely. There's studies that have been done that the majority of quote-unquote terrorist acts, regardless of how you define terrorism, that they come from people who are under occupation. Level of oppression will determine the intensity of the response. And the Shia always had a keen eye to oppression. Imam Ja'far Sadiq says that don't say that Zayd fought a battle, therefore we have to do that in every generation. And the Imam said that Zayd, he went to a government in order to take it off of its offensiveness, to weaken it so that it won't be able to oppress. Zayd did, alayhi salam, what he did for a noble reason. Today, and then this is the key part of the Imam's message, he says, be very careful if you're going to give your life. You only have one life. Don't throw it away. Not every rising, not every rebellion, not every movement against oppression is worth it. And it's sometimes not going to be death. It might be imprisonment. It's worth going to prison in certain cases, but it's not worth it in all cases. So the message of the Imam is beware. And the reason why the Imam says that is that it's not just religious people, religious or non-religious people, we sometimes have that tendency to cheapen the value of even our own lives. A person in Daesh may throw away their life for an act of violence, but there are many people who are not religious, who throw away their life and they commit a crime to say that I want to die, I want to commit suicide, but I'm going to go out with a bang. People are going to remember my name. Right? The reason that that exists in whatever form is because the value of one's own life is cheapened. And that's a message that Islam tells us we have to avoid. And I think that we probably have to get the number for qatilu and then answer your question and conclude, correct?
Qatilu, how many? Okay, next time we do that.
Okay, so suspense?
Quick question for you.
So go ahead.
And then one quick statement. Before I do that, right now there is a campaign around US that is started by CARE that to tell media not to call ISIL, Daesh, whatever, Islamic State. Don't call them Islamic. IS, you want to call them, fine. Don't call them Islamic State. So what do you think that, what are they looking for in that perspective, why are they insisting for media not to call them Islamic State, in your opinion?
The reason is that they want to assert that Islam is not just what Muslims do. And that's a debate that's existing in academia and in the media, that, you know, some people actually say that, well, Daesh is Muslim, and therefore what they do is Islamic because they're using Islamic sources. And it's a very important message for all Muslims, Sunni and Shia, to assert the fact that it's not the case that Islam is whatever Muslims do. And so if I decide that I'm going to, you know, dress in a certain way, and then I'm going to quote a Quranic verse, whatever interpretation I give is a Muslim or an Islamic reality. Islam has an internal logic. Islam has a well-recognized set of values and teachings. And what Daesh does cannot be considered Islamic under any circumstances, regardless of who is engaging in those acts, and regardless of what justifications they may use. I believe that's a very important point to make, and I would say that we have to go one step further. It's not just Daesh that we have to assert is un-Islamic, but any form of takfirism, any form of Wahhabism. Yes, it's time that we as Muslims were a little bit more clear that this is not Islam.
After the Iranian Revolution, there was jihad against ignorance, which was jihad jihad against injustice, and jihad against enslavement, and all those things that were being spread around. Can you a little bit please elaborate on that, and why after the Islamic Revolution there was such importance was given to jihad in a non-battle form of it?
That's a good point, I think, for us to conclude on. The terminology jihad is noble terminology. You mentioned a boy named Jihad. There was a time when Muslims used to name their kids Jihad or Mujahid. And I think that probably for the last 12, 13 years, 14 years, we've probably seen the statistics go down. We as Muslims need to reclaim these terms. We can't let the media define them, and so we're afraid of the word jihad. We find other terms. Jihad is a very beautiful concept. It's a noble concept. It's a Quranic concept. It's mentioned in the ahadith. And I think it's a very good thing that you find in Iran, where you have the construction jihad, jihad al-Sadami, you have the jihad against illiteracy. That is a very clear inspiration from the Quran, and it's reclaiming the word jihad for its constructive sense. And that's something that all of us should do. We shouldn't be afraid to name our personal struggles and our community struggles and our spiritual efforts as a jihad. All of them are part of that struggle.
Sulaiman, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.